I was talking to someone the other day, and somehow we got onto the topic of their kid. Their son is a young teenager, so out of curiosity I asked, would you say he's more of an introvert or an extrovert? And they immediately went, oh, he's a classic introvert. And then came the usual, he doesn't talk much, he likes staying in his room, he doesn't like big groups. And I remember thinking, okay, but that actually doesn't really tell me anything. Because yeah, sure, he could be an introvert, or he could just be shy, or socially anxious, like you. Or he's just a teenager going through puberty and discovering that people are, in fact, annoying. And that got me thinking, what do we actually mean when we call someone an introvert? Because if you ask most people, you'll probably get the usual quiet, likes being alone, doesn't like parties, and an extrovert? Outgoing, talkative, social, loves being around people. Pretty simple, except reality doesn't really work like that. An introvert can be incredibly charismatic. I mean, look at me. I am very funny guy, you know? Very charismatic, very handsome, very intelligent, very kind, very likable, and most importantly, very humble. But yeah, an introvert can love parties.
За монолит!
They can talk for 3 hours straight about something they're obsessed with. An extrovert can be shy. They can hate parties. They can be awkward as hell. So, if all of these things can exist on either side, what the hell are we actually talking about? Because the original idea behind these words is a lot more interesting than quiet person equals introvert, talkative person equals extrovert. And it starts with a pretty simple question. Where does your attention naturally go? Carl Jung was the person who really developed introversion and extroversion into the psychological concepts we know today. And he wasn't trying to figure out who likes parties. He was interested in something much more fundamental. How does a person relate to the world? Very broadly, Jung described introversion and extroversion as two different attitudes. One is oriented more toward the objective world, what's happening outside you, and the other is oriented more toward the subjective world, your experience of what's happening. And this sounds much more complicated than it actually is. When something happens, you meet someone, you hear an idea, something goes wrong, there's the thing itself, and then there's what happens inside you because of it. You interpret it, you give it meaning, you compare it to what you already know, you decide what you think. You decide what you're going to do. And we're constantly moving between these two modes. What's happening outside us and what's happening inside us. Jung's idea was that we don't all approach that relationship in exactly the same way. For some people, the outside world tends to have a stronger pull. They focus on what's happening, what's everyone doing, what can I do about this. They get involved and see what happens. For others, the inner experience tends to have the stronger pull. They focus on things like, what do I think about this? What does this mean? How does this fit with what I already believe? Let me figure this out first. And obviously, everyone does both. An introvert isn't walking around inside some invisible bubble, unless, of course, you're living in a cave, like me. And an extrovert isn't a golden retriever chasing every moving object. Although, some people are getting dangerously close to that. The difference is that one direction tends to have a little more pull, and once you look at it that way, the stereotypes start falling apart pretty quickly. Imagine you meet someone new. You start talking. They say something unexpected. Now watch what happens. One person might immediately start engaging with the situation and ask, who is this person? Why the fuck are they putting ketchup on spaghetti? Is the wine actually cold? Where is this conversation going? They're already interacting with what's happening in front of them. Another person might immediately start processing their own reaction to it. Why did that bother me? Wait, Do I actually prefer pineapple with ketchup spaghetti instead? Wait, I wonder what actually caused the fall of the Roman Empire. They're still paying attention to the other person. They're just coming at it from a different direction. Same conversation, same person, same words, but not necessarily the same starting point. And that's really the interesting part. I'm not saying one person is permanently looking outward while the other is permanently trapped inside their own head. That would be ridiculous. We're all doing both. It's actually much more subtle than that. One direction just tends to have a little more magnetic pull, and that's also why you can't really identify this stuff just by looking at someone, because we see what they do, but we don't see everything that happened before they did it. And this is where I think the distinction becomes useful, because both directions have their own problems. If you're naturally more inwardly oriented, you can get very good at thinking. You can analyze, you can reflect, you can plan. You build an incredibly detailed picture in your head. And then, 3 years later, you're still preparing to do the thing you started preparing to do 3 years ago. At some point, you have to let reality interrupt you. You have to actually do. Because you can construct the most beautiful little world inside your head and never actually do anything with it. But the opposite can happen too. If you're naturally more outwardly oriented, you can become very good at responding. When something happens, you react, you adapt, you solve it. Something else happens, you solve that too. And you're constantly moving until eventually you stop and realize, wait, did I ever actually decide that this is what I wanted? You can become incredibly good at navigating life without ever stopping to ask where you're actually going. And maybe that's why both directions matter. You need to be able to go inward, and then you need to come back out. But I still refuse to leave my cave. And this brings me back to the teenager. When his parents said, he's a classic introvert, maybe he is. But now I'm curious about something else. I don't care whether he talks a lot, whether he likes parties, or whether he likes being alone. I'd want to know how he naturally approaches things. When something happens, does he immediately engage with it, or does he first need to figure out what he thinks about it? When he has a problem, does he want to talk about it, or does he want to disappear for a while and figure it out for himself? Those questions don't give you a perfect answer either, because personality isn't a neat little box. But they are getting closer to what Jung was actually trying to describe. Because he's quiet tells me what I can see. It doesn't necessarily tell me what's happening underneath. And that's really why I wanted to make this video. We use these two words constantly, while often just referring to the stereotypes attached to them. Likes parties, hates parties. At this point, apparently the entire field of personality psychology is just asking people if they like parties. He left the party at 10:30. Classic introvert. Shut up! I just want to go back into my cave. And that's the problem. We're trying to figure out what's going on inside someone by looking at what's happening only on the outside. But the same behavior can come from completely different places. Someone can be quiet at a social event because they're thinking, or because they're anxious, or they're bored, or they simply have nothing to say. Yeah, imagine that. Someone can be talkative because they love people, or because they're nervous, or because they're excited, or because they physically cannot tolerate silence for more than 7 seconds. So the behavior itself doesn't tell us everything. The more interesting part is what's happening underneath. The way someone tends to relate to the world and to their own experience of it. And since personality is not a neat little box, this is not binary. Nobody is 100% anything. Nobody lives entirely inside their head, except for me. And nobody lives entirely outside of it. We move between the two constantly. So instead of asking, am I an introvert or an extrovert, maybe just pay a little more attention to yourself. When something happens, what tends to grab you first? Is it what's happening outside you? or your experience of it. Because two people can stand in the same exact place, experience the same exact thing, and still start from completely different places. And maybe that's what Jung was actually getting at. Anyway, that's what I got from asking a random parent about their teenager. So if you're that teenager, I'm sorry. I just made an entire YouTube video about you. Alright, back to the cave. Vitamin D's propaganda anyway.